Dust choked the desert air as 100 miles of empty highway stretched ahead. Blood stained his knuckles, and a loaded .45 pressed against his ribs. He only cared about the brotherhood until a terrified 6-year-old sprinted toward his roaring Harley, screaming a phrase that shattered his hardened soul. The Mojave Desert, in July, is a merciless crucible. Out on California State Route 127, near the fringes of Death Valley, the asphalt doesn't just get hot, it turns into a shimmering, mirage-soaked skillet that can boil the sanity right out of a man. For Jackson "Bull" Davies, the heat was just another Tuesday. Bull was the sergeant-at-arms for the San Bernardino chapter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. At 42, he was a mountain of a man, standing 6'4" with arms the size of tree trunks, covered in faded ink that told a story of violence, loyalty, and time served behind bars at San Quentin. He rode a customized 1968 Harley-Davidson Panhead, stripped down, loud as a thunderstorm, and painted matte black. On this particular afternoon, in the late summer of 2003, Bull was on a solo run. The club's president, Iron Mike Sullivan, had dispatched him ahead of the pack to scout a route to Nevada and secure a clandestine meeting spot with the Nomads chapter. Pounding the pavement at 80 miles per hour, Bull was in his element. The rhythmic vibration of the V-twin engine, the wind whipping against his leather cut, the iconic winged death head patch emblazoned on his back. This was his freedom. His saddlebags were heavy with 3 unregistered firearms and several bundles of cash. Getting pulled over was not an option. Stopping for Good Samaritan work was explicitly against his personal code and club survival instincts. Up ahead, the horizon warped and twisted in the heat waves. Through his mirrored aviators, Bull spotted a dark shape resting on the shoulder of the desolate 2-lane highway. As he closed the distance, the shape resolved into a rusted, pale blue 1989 Ford Taurus. The hood was propped open like the gaping maw of a dead fish, and thin wisps of white smoke were curling up from the radiator. Beside the vehicle stood a woman. She was frantically waving a bright red piece of cloth, a child's t-shirt in the air, her face twisted in absolute desperation. Bull didn't roll off the throttle. Out here, a broken-down car could be a trap. Rivals, desert rats looking for a score, or just a mess he didn't have the time to clean up. His eyes scanned the brush, his right hand instinctively hovering near the leather holster concealed beneath his vest. He shifted his weight, preparing to drift into the left lane and blast right past them. The roar of his pipes echoed across the salt flats, a mechanical beast warning the world to stay back. But then he saw the boy. He couldn't have been more than 6 years old. He was covered in dirt, his face streaked with tears, wearing nothing but denim shorts. As the deafening roar of the Harley grew closer, shaking the very ground beneath them, the boy did the unthinkable. He broke away from his mother's grasp. Darting out from the safety of the gravel shoulder, the child sprinted directly onto the blistering asphalt of the highway, placing his tiny, fragile body dead in the center of Bull's lane. Bull's heart slammed against his ribs. Jesus Christ. The mother screamed, lunging forward, but her foot caught the edge of a pothole, sending her crashing hard into the dust. Bull had less than 3 seconds. At 80 miles per hour, hitting the brakes too hard on a chopped panhead without an anti-lock system meant going over the handlebars or high-siding into a fatal roll. He clamped down on the rear brake, feathering the front, throwing his entire massive frame to the left to force the bike into a controlled skid. The tires shrieked, laying down a thick black strip of burning rubber. Smoke billowed around him as the heavy machine fishtailed violently. Through the chaos, over the screaming tires and the roaring engine, Bull heard a sound that cut straight through the mechanical din. It was a raw, primal shriek tearing from the boy's throat. "Please don't leave me!" The Harley shuddered and stalled, coming to a violent halt just 4 feet from the child's bare toes. Silence slammed down on the desert like a physical weight, broken only by the sharp ping, ping, ping of the overheated motorcycle engine and the heavy, ragged breathing of the biker. Bull sat frozen astride his machine. His knuckles were white inside his leather gloves. He looked down at the boy. The child wasn't looking at him with fear. He was staring past him, down the long, empty highway behind Bull, crying with a hopeless devastation that didn't belong on a kid's face. Before Bull could speak, the mother scrambled off the dirt, her knees bleeding, and snatched the boy by the arm, dragging him back toward the smoldering Ford Taurus. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed hysterically, pressing the child against her chest. "I'm sorry, please, don't hurt us. We don't have anything." Bull slowly swung his heavy steel-toed boot over the saddle and planted his boots on the asphalt. He reached up, pulling off his aviators. His face was a map of hard miles, a thick, graying beard, a broken nose, and cold, pale blue eyes that usually struck terror into men twice his size. But right now, those eyes were trying to process the scene before him. The Hell's Angel, a man whose life was dictated by violence, territory, and a strict brotherhood code, had just gotten off his bike. The heat radiating off the highway was oppressive, pushing the temperature to a lethal 112 degrees. Bull stood beside his idling motorcycle, the heat haze making him look like a phantom stepping out of a blast furnace. He took a slow, heavy step toward the woman. She flinched, retreating until her back slammed against the rusted door of the Taurus. She was terrified, and she had every right to be. Bull wore his colors, the leather cut that screamed danger to the civilian world. The rocker on his back proudly displayed California, declaring his territory, and the patches on the front indicated his rank and his willingness to shed blood for the club. "Keep the kid off the damn road," Bull growled, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that had commanded respect in prison yards and biker bars alike. "Next time, the guy coming won't have the brakes for it." I know. I'm sorry," she stammered, her hands trembling as she stroked the boy's matted hair. He panicked. Bull looked at the kid. The boy, Leo, was still staring down the highway, his chest heaving. "Who was he yelling at?" Bull asked, his eyes narrowing. "He wasn't looking at me when he said, 'Don't leave me.'" The woman, whose name was Sarah Collins, let out a choked sob. The dam broke. Out here in the middle of nowhere, faced with a terrifying outlaw biker, she had no fight left. The truth spilled out of her in a rush of panicked, breathless words. My ex-boyfriend Sarah wept, wiping a mixture of sweat and dirt from her forehead. "His name is Richard Dawson. I told him I was leaving him today. He said he would drive us to the bus station in Baker. But he didn't." Bull glanced at the smoking engine of the Taurus. He noticed the radiator hose was cleanly sliced, and the distributor cap was missing entirely. This wasn't a mechanical failure. This was sabotage. "He pulled over here," Sarah continued, her voice trembling. "He popped the hood, told me to come look. When I got out, he reached in, grabbed my purse, ripped the wires out, and ran to his buddy's truck that was following us. He took all my money. He took our water." She looked at Leo, her eyes filled with a maternal terror that struck a deeply buried chord in Bull's chest. "He left us here to die." Leo was chasing his truck. Bull felt a cold knot tighten in his gut, a stark contrast to the blistering desert heat. He was a criminal. He had hurt people. He collected debts with a baseball bat and ran illicit cargo across state lines. But the Hell's Angels, despite their reputation, operated on a code. You don't mess with kids, and you don't leave women to die in the desert. That was a coward's move. That was civilian trash behavior. He looked at his watch. 2:15 p.m. Dutch and Iron Mike were expecting him in Vegas by nightfall. If he got caught out here with the guns and the cash in his saddlebags, he was looking at 20 years minimum under the federal three-strikes law. The smartest, safest play was to toss her a canteen of water, kick his bike into gear, and ride away. Let the highway patrol find them. He turned back to his panhead. He grabbed the heavy leather straps of his saddlebag. "Are you a monster?" The small, quiet voice stopped Bull in his tracks. He turned his head slowly. Little Leo had stopped crying. He had wiped his nose on the back of his dirty hand and was staring right at the flaming skull tattooed on Bull's right forearm. Bull let out a dark, breathless chuckle. "Depends entirely on who you ask, kid." He didn't open the saddlebag holding the contraband. Instead, he opened the left pouch and pulled out 2 large military surplus canteens. He walked over and handed one to Sarah. "Drink it slow," Bull ordered. "You chug it, you'll puke, and you'll dehydrate faster." Sarah took it with trembling hands, immediately lifting it to Leo's lips before taking a sip herself. "Thank you. Oh God, thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Bull said, pulling a heavy wrench from his tool roll. He walked to the front of the Taurus and inspected the damage. It was worse than he thought. Rick hadn't just taken the distributor cap. He had smashed the spark plugs and sliced the alternator belt. The car was a 1,000-pound paperweight. "Car's dead," Bull stated bluntly, wiping grease on his jeans. "I can't fix this with what I've got. And out here, without shade, you two have maybe 3 hours before the heat stroke puts you in a coma." Sarah began to hyperventilate. "What do we do? Please, you have to help us." Bull stared down the shimmering highway. He could put them on the back of his bike, but riding two up with a squirming kid on a rigid-frame chopper for 70 miles was dangerous. Plus, pulling into a gas station with a battered woman and a crying kid while carrying 3 illegal firearms was a magnet for the police. Suddenly, a low, guttural rumble broke the silence. It wasn't a motorcycle. Far down the highway, in the direction Sarah had been pointing earlier, a massive cloud of dust kicked up. A lifted, jet-black Chevy Silverado was cresting the distant hill, roaring back toward their position. Sarah let out a blood-curdling scream, dropping the canteen into the dirt. "It's him! It's Rick's truck!" He told me he was going to come back in an hour to watch me beg. She frantically tried to pull Leo into the dead car, desperate to lock the useless doors. "Hide! Please hide!" she yelled at Bull. "He has a gun! He's crazy!" Jackson Bull Davies didn't hide. He had stood down rival cartels, riot police, and prison shanks. A desert trash coward in a lifted Chevy didn't even register on his radar of fear. The heavy metal of the .45 caliber pistol pressed against his ribs, a comforting weight. A dark, dangerous shadow crossed the Hells Angels' face. The biker code was absolute. You mind your own business. But Rick Dawson had just made the fatal mistake of interrupting a patch-holding member of the Hamsi while he was trying to think. "Stay in the car, Sarah," Bull said, his voice dropping an octave, turning cold and flat. He slowly walked away from his motorcycle, stepping right into the middle of the highway. He crossed his massive arms over his chest, his boots planted wide on the dividing line. The Desponig whipped the bottom of his leather cut, exposing the heavy chain attached to his belt. He watched the black Silverado accelerate, hurtling toward them at 70 miles an hour, right toward the spot where a 6-year-old boy had stood just minutes before. Bull didn't flinch. He waited for the devil to arrive. The black Chevy Silverado tore down Route 127 like a bruised knuckle dragging across sandpaper, kicking up a massive plume of white alkaline dust. Inside the cab, the driver, a twitchy local named Billy, leaned over the steering wheel. In the passenger seat sat Rick Dawson, a man whose hollow, sunken eyes and aggressive jawline told the story of a lifetime fueled by cheap amphetamines and petty cruelties. Rick had come back to watch Sarah break. He wanted to see her on her knees in the dirt, begging for her life, pleading for a sip of water for her bastard kid. Instead, standing dead center in the blinding glare of the afternoon sun, was a walking nightmare. "Who the hell is that?" Billy stammered, slamming his foot on the brake pedal. The heavy truck fishtailed, its oversized off-road tires biting violently into the scorching asphalt. The Silverado came to a shuddering halt 50 yards from the rusted Taurus. Through the windshield, Rick squinted through the heat distortion. He saw the matte black chopper parked on the shoulder. He saw the sheer physical mass of the man blocking the highway. And then, his eyes locked onto the patches. The crimson lettering on a stark white background. The winged death head. "Son of a bitch," Rick muttered, feeling a cold sweat prickle the back of his neck despite the 112-degree heat. "It's a 1%er. Hells Angels." "Rick, man, tell me we ain't messing with the club," Billy whined, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. "You said we were just scaring your ex." "Shut up, Billy," Rick snapped, his ego overriding his survival instincts. The amphetamines surging through his bloodstream convinced him he was invincible. He reached behind the seat and pulled out a sawed-off Remington 870 pump-action shotgun. "He's just one guy. Probably broke down. I ain't letting some biker trash tell me what to do with my property." Rick kicked his door open and stepped out onto the highway. The heat hit him like a physical blow, but he ignored it, racking the slide of the shotgun with a loud, metallic clack-clack that echoed across the empty desert. "Hey, patch holder!" Rick yelled, raising the barrel slightly, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and chemical bravado. "This ain't club business. You step aside, get on your scooter, and ride away. The bitch and the kid belong to me." Jackson Bull Davies didn't flinch. He didn't reach for the .45 concealed beneath his leather cut. He just stood there, his massive arms crossed, his pale blue eyes locked onto Rick with the cold, dead gaze of an apex predator watching a wounded rabbit thrash in a snare. To a man who had survived the brutal, bloody wars of the California penal system, a jittery tweaker with a scattergun was an annoyance, not a threat. "You got 3 seconds to put that toy down, kid." Bull's voice boomed across the asphalt, deep and steady, devoid of any emotion. "Before I make you eat it." Rick's jaw tightened. "I said back off. I'll blow a hole right through that stupid vest." Inside the Taurus, Sarah screamed, covering Leo's body with her own. Bull uncrossed his arms and took a step forward. Slow, deliberate. The heavy chains on his boots clinked against the pavement. He didn't zigzag. He walked in a straight, terrifying line toward the barrel of the shotgun. 1, Bull counted, his voice cutting through the heavy desert air. Rick's finger trembled on the trigger. He expected the biker to run, to draw a weapon, to take cover. He didn't expect this slow, unrelenting march of death. "I swear to God, I'll do it." 2, Bull said, taking another step. He was 30 yards away now. "Billy, get the rifle!" Rick screamed over his shoulder, his bravado instantly evaporating. But when he glanced back, Billy's door was already open. Billy was sprinting into the desert scrub, abandoning the truck, Rick, and the shotgun, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a Hell's Angel. That split-second distraction was all Bull needed. Bull closed the distance with a speed that defied his massive frame. By the time Rick turned his head back around, the Hell's Angel was already inside his guard. Rick panicked and pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing happened. In his drug-addled rush, Rick had forgotten to disengage the safety. Before Rick could correct his mistake, Bull's left hand shot out like a piston, clamping around the hot steel barrel of the shotgun and ripping it from Rick's grip with enough force to dislocate Rick's shoulder. Rick screamed, spinning wildly, but Bull's right hand was already moving. It wasn't a punch. It was an open-handed palm strike. A brutal, bone-shattering blow delivered straight to the center of Rick's chest. The impact sounded like a baseball bat hitting a side of beef. Rick's feet actually left the pavement. He flew backward, slamming into the grill of the Silverado before crumbling to the asphalt, gasping for air like a fish thrown onto a dock. Bull ejected the shells from the Remington, watching them clatter onto the highway, then tossed the empty weapon into the back of the truck. He walked over to where Rick was writhing on the ground, clutching his chest. Bull grabbed Rick by the collar of his grease-stained shirt and hauled him upward, slamming his back against the truck's radiator grill. "Listen to me, you worthless piece of desert trash," Bull whispered, his face inches from Rick's. The smell of fear, stale sweat, and cheap beer radiated off the younger man. "I'm Sergeant-at-Arms of the San Bernardino chapter. You just pulled a gun on me. By club rules, I have the right to bury you in a shallow grave behind that cactus, and nobody would ever find your teeth." Rick was sobbing now, a pathetic weeping mess. "Please, man. I didn't know. I was just mad at her." "You left a 6-year-old boy out here to bake to death," Bull said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. "That ain't anger. That's evil." Bull released Rick, letting him slump back to the ground. He reached into Rick's pocket and pulled out the keys to the Silverado, along with a thick wad of cash, the money Rick had stolen from Sarah's purse. "Take your boots off," Bull ordered. Rick looked up, confused and terrified. "What?" "Take your boots off," Bull repeated, resting his hand on his hip, just inches from his concealed .45. Trembling, Rick untied his work boots and slipped them off. "Now start walking." Bull pointed toward the barren, shimmering expanse of the Mojave in the opposite direction of the truck. "It's about 40 miles to Baker. If you stick to the shadows, you might make it before the coyotes find you. If I ever see your face again, If I ever hear you went looking for Sarah, I will bring the entire charter down on you. Do you understand me?" Rick nodded frantically, his face pale. He turned and began to limp away, barefoot, on the blistering asphalt, whimpering with every step. Bull watched him go for a long moment, making sure the rat wouldn't turn back. Then, he turned on his heel and walked back to the rusted Taurus. Sarah was staring at him through the cracked windshield, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. Bull tapped on the glass. "Get out of the oven, Sarah. Grab the boy. We're taking the truck." The air conditioning in the Silverado blasted like an Arctic storm, a sharp contrast to the hellish oven outside. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her hands wrapped tightly around the leather grips of the door. Little Leo was asleep in the back seat, exhausted by the trauma and the heat, clutching the empty military canteen like a teddy bear. Bull was behind the wheel of the truck. He had a major logistical problem. A true one-percenter never abandons his motorcycle. The panhead was not just a machine. It was an extension of his soul, customized over a decade, and it represented his standing in the club. Furthermore, the saddlebags contained 3 unregistered Glock 19s and $30,000 in tightly banded club cash money meant for a crucial transaction with the Nevada nomads. He couldn't leave the bike, but he also couldn't put Sarah and Leo on the back of it. Nor could he let Sarah drive the Silverado. She was shaking so violently from shock she couldn't even manage the seatbelt. So, Bull had made a risky call. He had quickly unbuckled his saddlebags, tossed them into the hidden storage compartment beneath the truck's rear seats, and used a heavy steel tow chain from the bed of the truck to hitch the Harley to the rear bumper of the Silverado. It was a humiliating way to transport a chopper, but it was the only way to keep the weapons, the money, the bike, and the civilians together. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. She kept glancing at Bull's heavily tattooed arms gripping the steering wheel. "Town called Shoshone. About 20 miles up," Bull replied, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirrors. "There's a Greyhound stop behind the general store. I'll buy you 2 tickets to wherever you want to go. Vegas, LA, doesn't matter. You disappear." "Why are you doing this?" she asked, turning to face him fully. Rick said, "He said your kind are monsters, that you hurt people for money." Bull let out a rough sigh. "I ain't a saint, Sarah. I've done things that would keep you awake at night. But my club has rules. You don't mess with kids. You don't leave people to die." Rick's a coward. I despise cowards. They drove in silence for another 10 miles. Bull was calculating his timeline. He was going to be late for the meet. Iron Mike was not a forgiving president, and explaining that he was delayed because he was playing Boy Scout to a battered woman wouldn't fly in the clubhouse. He needed to drop them off, unhitch his bike, and ride like hell for the state line. Suddenly, the radar detector on the Silverado's dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree, emitting a high-pitched, frantic beep. Bull cursed under his breath. He checked the speedometer. He was doing exactly the limit, but it didn't matter. In the rearview mirror, he saw the blinding strobe of red and blue lights cresting the hill behind them. "Oh my God," Sarah gasped, turning around. "It's the police. We're driving Rick's truck. He's going to say we stole it." "Stay calm," Bull ordered, feeling a cold sweat break out across his back. He had 30 grand in illicit drug money and 3 illegal handguns directly beneath a sleeping 6-year-old. If the cops searched the truck, he was going back to San Quentin for the rest of his natural life. And without him, Sarah and Leo would be thrown into the county system, right back into Rick's orbit. Bull pulled the heavy truck onto the gravel shoulder, the chained Harley dragging awkwardly behind them. He watched the side mirror. A battered, tangent and green Inyo County Sheriff's cruiser parked at an angle behind them. The door popped open, and a heavy-set deputy stepped out, adjusting his duty belt. Bull recognized him immediately. Deputy Hap Callahan. Callahan was notoriously corrupt, a badge-carrying bully who made his living extorting truckers and shaking down small-time desert meth cooks. Worse, Bull knew that Callahan frequently looked the other way for the Desert Rats, the local tweaker gang that Rick Dawson ran with. Callahan approached the driver's side window, his hand resting casually on the butt of his sidearm. Bull rolled the window down, keeping his hands 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. hiding the death head patch on his back against the seat. "Well, well," Callahan drawled, leaning down to peer into the cab. His eyes flicked to Sarah, then back to Bull. "This here vehicle belongs to a local boy. Ricky Dawson. You ain't Ricky. Rick lent it to us," Bull lied, his voice remarkably steady. "His girl's car broke down back on 127. We're just getting her and the kid to the bus station." Callahan smirked, a nasty, knowing smile. He noticed the heavy silver skull rings on Bull's fingers and the tattoos peeking out from the collar of his shirt. "That right? Funny, Ricky just called dispatch from a payphone at the jerky stand down south. Said his truck was carjacked by a giant biker and his crazy ex-girlfriend." Sarah let out a muffled sob, burying her face in her hands. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," Callahan commanded, unclipping the retention strap on his holster. "Keep your hands where I can see 'em." Bull's mind raced. He could draw his .45, put a bullet in Callahan's shoulder, and make a run for it. But that meant turning a weapons charge into an attempted murder of a police officer, and doing it in front of a child. It was a dead end. Slowly, Bull opened the door and stepped out into the blazing sun. As he turned, his leather cut became fully visible. Callahan stepped back, his eyes widening slightly as he read the patches. "San Berdu Hells Angels. Out of your jurisdiction, ain't you, boy?" "I'm just passing through, deputy," Bull said, his voice low. "No trouble here. You know me, and you know my club. We don't steal beat-up Chevy trucks." "The kid almost died out there. Rick left him to cook." Callahan spat a stream of chewing tobacco onto the dirt. "I don't give a damn about club politics, and I don't give a damn about domestic squabbles. I got a stolen vehicle report. I'm taking you all in, and I'm impounding this truck. Put your hands on the hood." Bull knew what impounding meant. They would inventory the vehicle. They would lift the back seat. They would find the guns and the money. The Hampsey would lose its capital, the Nevada deal would fall through, and Bull would be dead before he even made it to a prison cell. "Listen to me, Callahan," Bull said, ignoring the order to turn around. He took a calculated half-step toward the deputy. "You take this truck, you find what's inside it, and it becomes evidence. You think you're getting a commendation?" Callahan narrowed his eyes, his hand tightening on his gun. "What are you talking about?" "I'm carrying club property," Bull bluffed, injecting every ounce of quiet menace he possessed into his voice. "Important property. You put that in an evidence locker, my president is going to know exactly who took it. You think the Hells Angels care about a badge in Inyo County? We know where you live, Hap. We know about the kickbacks you take from the desert rats. You take me in, your life becomes very complicated, very quickly." Callahan hesitated. The Mojave was vast and empty, and the Hells Angels were notorious for their long reach and absolute ruthlessness. The deputy weighed the prospect of a stolen vehicle arrest against a potential war with a heavily armed outlaw motorcycle club. "What's your play, biker?" Callahan asked, his tone dropping the false bravado. "You let the woman and the kid get back in the truck," Bull negotiated. "I'll unhook my bike. I'll put my gear on it. She drives the truck to the sheriff's station and turns the keys in herself. Tells him Rick let her use it. Just a misunderstanding. I ride away. You never saw me." Callahan looked at Sarah in the passenger seat, then at the sleeping kid. He didn't want the paperwork of a domestic dispute, and he certainly didn't want club heat. "You got 5 minutes to get your crap off this truck," Callahan snapped, stepping back. "And if I ever see that patch in my county again, I'll shoot you for resisting arrest." Bull didn't waste a second. He moved to the back of the truck, opened the door, and gently lifted the sleeping Leo to get to the hidden compartment. He yanked the heavy saddlebags out, slinging them over his shoulder. He walked around to the driver's side and looked at Sarah. He handed her the keys to the Silverado and the wad of cash he had taken from Rick. "Drive straight to the station," Bull instructed, his voice gentler than before. "Leave the truck there. Walk to the Greyhound station. Buy a ticket to the East Coast. Change your name." Sarah looked up at the towering, terrifying man who had just saved her life twice in one day. Tears streamed down her face. She reached out and grabbed his large, calloused hand. "I don't even know your name," she whispered. Bull looked down at the boy in the back seat, who was just beginning to stir. "Doesn't matter," Bull said, pulling his hand away and adjusting his sunglasses. "Just make sure the kid stays off the highway." Bull unchained the panhead with practiced efficiency. The heavy steel toe links clattered against the sun-baked asphalt, breaking the tense silence. He threw his heavy leather saddlebags over the rear fender, the familiar, dangerous weight of the unregistered Glocks, and $30,000 in club cash settling into place. He didn't look back at Deputy Callahan. He kicked the starter. The vintage V-twin engine roared to life, a mechanical beast drowning out the howl of the desert wind. Sarah put the Silverado in gear. She gave Bull one last look through the driver's side window, a look composed of profound gratitude and a lingering, instinctual fear, and pulled away, heading north toward Shoshone. Bull dumped the clutch and tore out in the opposite direction. He pushed the Harley to its absolute limit to make the Vegas rendezvous, the wind whipping violently against his leather cut. He made the meet with barely 10 minutes to spare. Iron Mike Sullivan chewed him out mercilessly in front of the Nomad's charter for cutting the timeline so close, threatening to strip Bull of his sergeant-at-arms patch. But the guns were delivered, the cash was exchanged, and the Nevada pipeline remained intact. The Hells Angels never knew that their most ruthless enforcer had risked the entire charter, his freedom, and his life for a civilian woman and a crying kid. 20 years faded into the rearview mirror. It was the autumn of 2023. Jackson Bull Davies was now 62 years old. The decades of hard riding, federal prison stints, and brutal club wars had taken their inevitable toll. His knees were shot, and his back ached when the rain rolled in. He had handed in his sergeant-at-arms rocker years ago, taking on a quieter role as an elder statesman for the San Bernardino charter. He spent his days out of the crosshairs, running a modest custom motorcycle shop on the edge of town, his hands perpetually stained with motor oil and grease. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, the brass bell above the shop door chimed. Bull wiped his hands on a dirty rag and walked out from the garage bay. Standing in the dimly lit showroom was a young man in his mid-20s. He was tall, clean-cut, and wore the crisp, dark navy uniform of a San Bernardino County paramedic. "Can I help you, kid?" Bull rasped, his voice still holding that heavy, intimidating gravel. The young paramedic didn't immediately answer. He stared at Bull. He looked at the graying beard, the deep lines etched into the old biker's face, and then down to his right forearm. The flaming skull tattoo was faded now, the black ink blurred and softened by time, but it was unmistakable. "I'm looking for a guy," the young man said, his voice trembling slightly, though not from fear. "A guy who rode a '68 Panhead, painted matte black, saved a life out near Death Valley, a long time ago." Bull narrowed his pale blue eyes, the instincts of a lifetime of paranoia flaring up. "Bike's been retired for 5 years. Who's asking?" The paramedic took a step closer. "My name is Leo Collins. 20 years ago, my mom and I were stranded on Route 127. My mom's ex had sabotaged our car and left us to bake on the asphalt." Bull froze. The greasy rag slipped from his calloused hands, hitting the concrete floor with a soft thud. The memory of the blistering alkaline dust, the rusted Ford Taurus, and the desperate, gut-wrenching scream of a child standing dead center in the middle of a highway rushed back with staggering clarity. "Please don't leave me." Bull started, the word catching in his throat. "We made it to the East Coast," Leo said, his eyes welling with tears. "Mom got a job in nursing. She raised me right. She told me the story every year on my birthday. About the giant on the black motorcycle who risked his own freedom to stand between us and the devil." Leo reached into his heavy duffel bag and pulled out a dented, olive-drab military canteen. It was scratched and old, but immaculately clean. "I kept this," Leo said quietly, placing the canteen on the glass counter. "It reminded me that even the most terrifying people can have the biggest hearts." The young man stepped forward and extended his hand. "I became a paramedic because I wanted to be the guy who shows up when people are screaming for help in the middle of nowhere. I wanted to be like you." For the first time in his hardened, violent life, Jackson Bull Davies felt a tear break the surface of his pale blue eyes. He didn't take the young man's hand. Instead, the giant, heavily tattooed former outlaw closed the distance and pulled the paramedic into a crushing embrace. The vicious cycle of trauma had been broken, not by the law, but by an outlaw who decided, just for one afternoon, to stop and listen to the desperate cry of a child. Sometimes, the greatest heroes wear leather cuts instead of capes, and salvation arrives on two wheels. If Jackson's incredible journey of raw bravery touched your heart, please hit that like button. Share this video with friends who need a reminder that humanity exists in the darkest places. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling true-life stories of unexpected heroes. Your support keeps these stories alive.
Hi, my name is Dominant Flame Escrow, the owner and manager of Dominant Flame Escrow. After watching the video, "Please don't leave me," the child cried, and the Hell's Angel got off his bike. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the emotional contrast between toughness and compassion. The biker probably looked intimidating to most people around him, but the moment that child cried out, something human and protective immediately took over. I think that's what gave the story its emotional impact. Sometimes, the people society judges the fastest are the ones who understand pain, fear, and loyalty more deeply than anyone expects. Do you think the biker saw something in that child that reminded him of his own past? Or was it simply impossible for him to walk away after hearing those words? And why do you think stories about unexpected kindness from unlikely people resonate so strongly with audiences?
I think stories like this remind us not to judge others too quickly and to recognize that compassion can come from places we least expect. If this story stayed with you emotionally, I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy biker stories filled with loyalty, heart, and unexpected human connection, feel free to like and subscribe only if you'd like to see more.